Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Good evening if you're calling in from Europe. I want to welcome everyone to the workshop on entrepreneurial finance and innovation. My co-organizers are Mike Ewan, Song Ma, and Yael Hochberg. Today, if you've joined previous seminars, we're going to do things a little bit differently today. Today we have 4 speakers. And we're going to talk about entrepreneurship in the age of COVID. So we're going to look at that question from 4 different points of view. We've got Chris Stanton, Jorge Guzman, Josh Lerner, and Yael Hochberg, who are each going to present some preliminary work that's looking at various aspects of how COVID is impacting the world of entrepreneurship and innovation. So the ground rules are, we're going to give the mic over to each presenter. They're going to go for 15 minutes. I'm not going to interrupt the speaker like we have in previous sessions. We're going to open the Q&A window. And if you have questions, please just type the question in the Q&A window. I will curate those questions. And then after the 4th speaker concludes, then we'll take selected questions in the time that remains. So the order of events here, we're going to start with Chris Stanton, who's going to give a presentation entitled, "How are small businesses adjusting to COVID-19? Evidence from a survey." Then we'll turn to Jorge, who is going to give us a paper, "The Impact of COVID-19 on U.S. Entrepreneurship, Early Evidence from the Startup Cartography Project." Then we'll jump over to Josh, who's going to give us a presentation called "Financial Distancing, How VC Follows the Economy Down and Curtails Innovation." And then we'll conclude with Yael, who has not yet told me the title of her talk. That's how fresh it is. So we'll save the best for last, I guess.
The impact of COVID on innovation-driven entrepreneurs, evidence from field experiment.
I knew I could count on you, Yael. So Yael will round out the hour as the 4th presenter. So without further ado, let me now turn it over to Chris Stanton.
Thanks, David. So this is a paper that is really battlefield social science, meaning there was a survey that kind of went live pretty rapidly. And the reason that the survey needed to go live rapidly is we wanted to get it out into the field before policy details around the PPP program and other programs in terms of aiding small businesses were really clarified, which would allow us to try to estimate counterfactual outcomes under different treatments or under different policies that businesses would be exposed to before the actual policy in question became baked into their minds. At the same time, as a result, that we have this snapshot prior to PPP funding going live, it will allow us to answer a couple of other questions, namely, how are small businesses adjusting employment and operations in response to conditions caused by COVID? What are their expectations about disruptions going forward, including their likelihood of remaining operational? And then what are their perceptions prior to program details became clear about how the impact of some various programs might affect business outcomes in the long run. So that's the goal. And the survey design that we used had 4 parts. The first was just trying to get a glimpse of what the small business landscape was like at the time of the survey, which was late March. The second part was trying to get a sense of the expectations of small business owners going forward, including how long they expect disruptions to last and their forecasts for remaining operational. The third part was to try and assess various federal policies and how that would translate into take-up of those policies and implications for whether businesses would remain operational and for their employment. And then finally, we provided random horizons for the duration of COVID's impact, and that allows us to just trace out how disruptions over a longer horizon would impact businesses over a longer term. So let me just jump in quickly because time is limited, and I now realize that when you have a survey, like the world is your oyster and you can do anything. And so I'll try to not present you with everything, but to just pick out the highlights. So the way that this survey went live was through a partner called Alignable. And for those of you who don't know what Alignable is, I didn't at the time that we ran this. Alignable is a network of small businesses. You can kind of think about it as a Facebook for small businesses. There are 4.6 million accounts on Alignable, and those accounts have sort of grown organically. And every week, Alignable distributes a poll or a pulse question to their members. Every week, somewhere between 50 to 70,000 members will end up looking at that email. A subset of those who look at the email will then trickle through into the pulse question. And what we ended up doing was tacking on a link to go to our survey at the end of the weekly Alignable pulse question. And we ended up getting about 5,800 responses, which is about a 10% conversion rate relative to the number of people who sort of started by opening the Alignable email. So this is clearly a convenience sample. And what I'll need to just do is show you how the convenience sample looks relative to the census of businesses. And so this data comes from the county business patterns for 2017. And this just breaks out firms by headcount. You can see that we pretty closely match the firm size distribution between the Alignable sample in the survey and what the firm size distribution is in the census. However, it should be noted that we're largely picking up very, very small businesses here. So about 30% of the respondents in total are businesses with either 0 or 1 other employee. And so the average firm in our sample is quite small, even though we approximate the firm size distribution pretty well. The second thing to note is that we do a reasonable job in terms of the distribution across states. So we're a little bit high in the survey relative to Florida, a little bit low relative to New York, a little bit high relative to California. But overall, we have a pretty nice representation, both geographically and in terms of the firm size distribution. And then there's more work in the paper to show you how we match across 2-digit NAICS industries and things like that. But overall, on most observables, we fit pretty well. The one place where we miss is that we're largely missing larger firms that appear to be highly productive. So if we look at average pay per employee, in the survey for at least firms that are above 10 employees and even those above sort of 5 employees, our average payroll per employee is quite a bit lower than what you would see or what would be implied in the census. And so as a result, I think that your mental model here should be that we're picking up sort of firms that are more likely to be sole proprietors or firms that are more likely to be sort of loosely organized mom and pops. What we're probably missing is like small boutique, high paying consulting firms or precision manufacturing or other firms that maybe sort of have reasonably high TFP or slightly more sophisticated. And the reason for that is that the Alignable network tends to be a network for referrals between businesses. And so our mental model, at least, is that these very sort of highly productive, like boutique consulting firms are probably not looking for referrals to like small mom and pop retailers, which tends to be the modal respondent in the survey. All right, with 9.5 minutes left, let me get to part 1, which is just a question about what the current state of small businesses would have been at the time of the survey. So think late March, early April. And the first question that we asked is just, is this business currently operational? There are a couple of responses. Yes, no, for a variety of reasons, pretty straightforward. Then we wanted to assess what the sources of disruptions might have been. And we gave businesses three potential answers that they could use a sliding scale to display some concern. These were having supply chain difficulties, worries about my own or employees' health, or having customers or orders that have declined. And then we asked about employment numbers. So as of January 31st of 2020 and as of today. And these are the results. So you can see that more than half of the businesses are currently open, but a big chunk are temporarily closed out of this table. A smaller minority are permanently closed. In total, about 34% or 35% was the fraction that chose that slider in terms of supply chain difficulties. A bigger number chose concerns about employee health, but demand or orders in the future tended to be the primary concern for most of these small business owners. Employment, according to our estimates, as of early April was down 39% from January. When we reweight those estimates to match the census distribution by geography and firm size, the estimate is employment declined by about 36%. We're a little bit higher than a recent estimate from ADP data based on payroll, where the average decline for firms under 500 employees was 26% in ADP. It was about 30% for firms with under 50 employees. So I think that probably reflects that we're largely picking up smaller firms who are probably a bit more vulnerable in the survey. But we're still sort of in the right ballpark for what other outside estimates from a broader and probably more representative sample without some of the selection concerns that we would have estimated in terms of employment declines. The next thing that we asked was about cash runway. And we asked this in terms of the typical monthly business expenses prior to COVID, and then how much cash they had on hand. And then we could just scale that cash on hand by rough monthly business expenses. And this is just the distribution of cash on hand that we had come out of the survey, which was the majority of businesses, or the modal response was about 1 to 2 months of cash on hand. This is closely related to an estimate from JP Morgan Chase that did a survey of small businesses based on accounts data, which suggested that the median small business had about 27 days of cash on hand. So you can see that if COVID disruptions are prolonged, that many of these small businesses would not have had cash on hand to cover their expenses. There's a question about the elasticity of being able to cut some expenses that some of our follow-up work is trying to look at, but it looks like sort of the cash on hand situation means that businesses don't have a ton of runway. We then followed up to ask how much sort of confidence business owners had about when COVID would be over and what their most likely forecast would be when COVID disruptions would end. And then we also followed up by trying to get a longer run forecast after asking this question about the likelihood that the business would remain operational by December 31st, 2020. And so these are the results. The median answer in terms of when COVID disruptions would end was about June 15th. And as of sort of the beginning of April, that actually seems like it may play out reasonably well as states are lifting some restrictions, but the median respondent here had a confidence level that was less than 5 out of 10 in their answer. Now, as a social scientist, I don't know how to interpret that, but I think as survey takers who are not social scientists, asking people about their confidence level with a fairly simple response suggests that people had wide confidence intervals, at least in terms of when they were talking about COVID ending. A small minority of respondents ended up saying that COVID would probably last at least a year. I think in hindsight, we would probably put some weight on second wave infections or things like that that might suggest that these might be longer term responses. But as of the date when we were asking this survey, it looks like about half of respondents probably suggested that disruptions would largely be over by July. Then you can see a question that is the likelihood of being open on December 31st as a function of whether the business had more or less than the median cash on hand. You can see that cash on hand tends to have a relationship with business owners' expectations. Those who had more than the median cash on hand are much more likely to report that they're extremely likely to be open on December 31st, whereas the math shifts leftward for those with less cash on hand. All right, so that's part 3. Part 2. Part 3 is trying to get at counterfactuals in terms of estimating demand for different government programs. And in order to do this, remember that this was at a time when the details of these programs were quite uncertain. And so what we ended up doing was varying hypothetical details about the federal aid policies in question. We told survey respondents as we varied these that there was a lot of policy uncertainty, but we wanted to understand how they would react to different policies that were displayed. And so this was a description of the CARES bill. We didn't nail it exactly right because at the time when the survey was deployed, we didn't actually know what the final details would be. But this was the text that users saw, and it was the text said, imagine a policy where the government allows you to borrow up to X times your typical monthly expenses without posting any collateral. You could use this money to cover any of your business expenses, but the loan will be forgiven by the amount spent on payroll, lease, rent, mortgage, and utility payments in the 8 weeks after origination. And you can consider this to be a grant. The remainder of the loan that is not spent on these items will have deferred payments for 1 year. After that, the loan will have an annual interest rate of 4%, which would be deferred for a year. And you would have up to 10 years to repay the loan. So we then gave them an example of what this meant in terms of their repayment schedule as a function of how much they borrowed. We did the same thing, but for a simple loan, which omitted the grant portion. We gave them the same sort of example of what borrowing $50,000 would be. But you can see that this text looks parallel except for the loan forgiveness provision. And then we just varied the borrowing base, so X times the typical monthly expenses, and that allowed us to assess sort of differences in program features as a function of demand and owners' expectations. And so then we asked follow-up questions like, would you apply for this program? And if enacted, how does it impact the likelihood of your business remaining operational by December 31st? And what you can see here is that there are some differences between the straight loan and the CARES Act, but even for sort of a straight loan in terms of policy take-up, many users would have taken up that policy relative to the CARES Act that was more generous. Now, I should mention that the interest rate that we specified is actually higher than the interest rate that is present in the CARES Act, but it looks like a little over 70% would have taken up the CARES Act. Less would have taken up the straight loan, except if the borrowing base is a multiple of monthly expenses is at least 4. And then we can't reject that those two things for borrowing bases at 4 or 6x of monthly expenses would be equal, but then sort of the straight loan kind of falls off a little bit. The way that I read this, and I might be over-interpreting it slightly, is that for a sufficiently generous straight loan, the demand for cash and the demand for liquidity is probably sufficiently high among these business owners that the loan forgiveness provisions probably aren't first order simply because they didn't have any money to begin with. The second result is that there are minimal differences for sufficiently large loans relative to the CARES Act in terms of expectations of being open in December. For loans that aren't very generous, you do find a difference, but the loans in the CARES Act seem to do about as well in terms of expectations for business resilience relative to other policies. There are also many respondents who would not have applied for a loan or a CARES Act, and there's some suggestion that other than those who don't need the cash, many didn't respond or wouldn't have taken up simply because they don't trust the government to forgive the loan, or because of hassle, or because of other reasons that put frictions between application and going through the program. Okay, the last part, I have 20 seconds. We then randomized hypothetical durations for COVID-19 and asked about business outcomes under this scenario. So we said, suppose that COVID-19 disruptions continue for X number of weeks. What is the likelihood your business remains operational by December? Please provide your best guess. This is the hypothetical crisis duration. You can see that the crisis duration plays a strong role in terms of how resilient businesses would be. So longer crises probably put a majority of small businesses in significant risk of closing relative to crisis that would last 1 or 2 months. And so we then break this down in the paper by industry. It kind of lines up where personal services or in-person types of businesses are much more at risk than, say, professional services where businesses can go remote. So in conclusion, small businesses appear to be in a fragile position. Disruptions for small businesses were already extreme towards the end of March or beginning of April. Beliefs about COVID disruptions were all over the map, but it looks like the median small business owner expected disruptions to persist through about mid-June. And the CARES Act was appealing to about 72%, but there are still signs that there were hurdles in terms of predicted take-up, which I think in hindsight, we probably nailed in terms of business owners' forecasts that the policy would have some frictions in getting aid to businesses that needed it. So I'm out of time. Thanks so much, and happy to take questions afterward.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was fascinating and terrific. Next, our second speaker is, and if you're joining the call, if you're joining the broadcast late, we've got 4 speakers lined up. We just heard from Chris Stanton. I'm going to turn it over to Jorge Guzman, who's going to take it over from here. Then we'll be followed by Josh and Yael. Jorge, take it away.
Sorry, thanks for everybody for being here, and thank you for the organizers for including me. That was a super interesting presentation from Chris. This is joint work with Kathy Facio, who's also here, and Scott Stern. And what we want to do is just use this tool we have developed over time called Start Cartography Project to try to understand a little bit about the evolution of new firm formation. So Chris presented an excellent survey on understanding existing businesses, and I think this is very complementary because I'm going to tell you a little bit about new business formation in the moment of COVID-19. And so let me tell you for a second what we do. Some people might know this project, the Startup Cartography Project, but I still tell you for a second what we do and then explain how we're able to use this to learn a little bit about the current economic scenario. This is, the broader project. This also joint work with RJ Andrews and Yuping Liu. And so what do we do here? Well, this is a project we have made to try to understand entrepreneurship all across the United States. What we do, and so this is our general map, we call it Cartography Projects. We try to measure the quality and quantity of firms across the US by working with business registrars. So when you create a company, there's a lot of things that happen, but one critical thing that tends to happen at above a certain level of formalization is that you register a business. So you actually have to go to a place called the Secretary of State and file some paperwork with you and your co-founders that says, this is going to be the name of the business. We're registering today. You have to make some choices. You choose if it's registered in Delaware, and then under Delaware jurisdiction in your state, you choose if it's a corporation, a partnership, etc. And basically, over this project, we were able to connect to all these secretaries of state across different states and to measure entrepreneurship. So here's what we have across the US, and here's how we do it over in New York City. And you can see we can get pretty granular. This is a classic sort of picture of New York City. You see, we measure entrepreneurship in Midtown and downtown and a lot less kind of in the Lower East Side. What we're going to do in this study is try to use this data for a few states. Let me jump ahead here. For a few states that actually we had a quicker turnaround in how quickly they're able to get us the data. And some of them, in fact, were able to give us data. Let's just say April 30th for Oregon, were able to give us data that encompasses a big portion of 2020. And I want to show you how business formation is changing based on what we're seeing here in terms of who's registering a company in 2020, and especially before and after kind of COVID-19 issues came about. From these, I'm hoping to give you 3 results. The first one is going to be that we actually see a massive drop in entrepreneurship measured as these firm formations from registrars since the COVID-19 lockdowns. In New York, there's about 11,000 quote unquote missing companies if you compare 2019 levels to 2020, and they're more likely to be locally oriented. And I'll show you how we do that. So here's the key graph that I hope you take from this presentation. This is New York. This is all firms registered in New York, during the year of 2020 in the solid line, and in the dotted line in kind of gray, you see the same measure for 2019, and we sort of adjust for day of week and those kind of things. And you see that basically firm formation in 2020 and 2019 looked super similar before we had sort of the pandemic really occurring. And right around the time the school closure and kind of restaurant closures began, which in New York was in March 15, we see a huge drop in entrepreneurship for 2020 compared to 2019. And as I said, if you try to kind of add up how big this difference is between March 15 and April 30th, we're seeing 11,000 less firms in New York. We actually look at the type of companies, and one thing we know from prior work is that local firms, there's firms, some firms can be registered in Delaware to do local business, as well as other firms are just registered under local jurisdiction. And what we see is that the drop is higher in firms under local jurisdiction than Delaware. And so because Delaware has been shown to be an indicator of high growth potential, we sort of imply from this, one interpretation from this is that it seems like the drop is higher in local firms than kind of more growth oriented firms. Here's a little bit more, you see this in Manhattan, you see this, here's Brooklyn. Let me actually show you super quickly how this shows in this kind of week by week map of entrepreneurship in New York. So you can see how kind of impressive the change is and how it's actually pretty widespread. So just so you know, the COVID lockdown strikes in week 11. So here's week 2 of 2020, and I'll show you, and as we get to week 11, keep in mind how this is looking. So we see week 2, week 3, week 4. This is when everything's normal. We see this sort of the normal kind of distribution that we see in New York of entrepreneurship and firm formation, week 6, week 7, week 8, week 9, week 10. This is week 11, that sort of coronavirus start. And then you see, right? So if you see that, there's a huge drop in total entrepreneurship. And then it stays super low, right? So we see very low levels here overall for several weeks. And then sort of it improves a little bit towards the end in week 16 and 17, which is kind of as late as our data gets. Here's Washington State. So we see a very similar pattern in Washington State, a big drop, as well as some recovery. I'll talk about that in just a second, but certainly a big drop. Now, just so you get a sense that this really seems to be a reduction in people trying to start firms, we actually are starting to see these as well in other data sets. So for example, John Haltiwanger looked at the number of EIN filings. So this is not happening in the local state offices where the COVID is happening, but actually in DC where you fax for your ability to do taxes. And he's really kind of seeing basically the same pattern, 40 to 50% drop in total EIN filings, as well as sort of Ulrich Kaiser does this for Denmark and kind of very similar pattern. So that's the first takeaway. There has been a massive drop in entrepreneurship since the COVID lockdowns, sort of 11,000 firms in New York, more likely to be locally oriented. Now, let me give you a sense of how important this is compared to other types of kind of shocks, economic shocks that you might have in mind that have occurred in the US. And let me compare it actually to 3. And we're going to see that this drop is longer, larger, sort of longer, deeper, and more substantial than 9/11, the financial crisis, and Hurricane Katrina. And so here's a similar graph for 9/11. Here's the sort of also in New York. And we see that there is a drop in firm formation after 9/11, but it's much smaller and actually kind of comes back sort of way faster. Here it is for the financial crisis. This is, here we're seeing the date of sort of when Lehman Brothers collapsed. And we also see a reduction in firm formation, but it's again smaller, way smaller than what we're seeing right now in New York State. And finally, here's a different type of kind of more natural disaster, in this case, a hurricane. And we see registrations in Louisiana. They do drop substantially during the first kind of couple of weeks when basically the hurricane was striking and things were getting back on track, but pretty quickly it gets back on track. So, I mean, here's the 4 of them together, just so you get a sense again. This really seems like a very big reduction in total firm formation. And even compared to these other kind of pretty consequential economic shocks that we've seen before, like 9/11, the Great Recession, Katrina, that were very important for these locations we're showing. So that's the second result. Now let me actually shift this a little bit, and I think there's slight amount of optimism because I think what you've been seeing so far is also this kind of corner of the graph, right? We did see this drop, but it also seems to be kind of coming back up, right? And we wonder, well, does that mean there was a big drop, but sort of the economy seems to keep going? I like to think, if entrepreneurs are starting companies, there must be a little bit more optimism in a way. Hopefully that means that they're seeing future opportunities and therefore they're deciding to start these companies. And it is in fact true. I mean, we're seeing quite a bit of a recovery. This is New York State and we still see a gap, but actually, here's Virginia. And in Virginia, we see a difference between 2019 and 2020, but that gap has shrunk by now. And here's Kentucky, and you basically see no gap at this point. Here's Missouri, and we also, again, see no gap. Now, let me give you sort of something that is super. Now, you might be wondering, who are these businesses coming back? Are they the same businesses or are they a little bit different? We did this like sort of non-scientific, just super simple analysis, but it actually hints a little bit that there might be a slightly different businesses. And what we did here was, I mean, all we have is the firm, what data they register, and we're really kind of working off of the name here. And just asking ourselves, well, how are these new businesses named, and does that indicate a slightly different business than before? And for example, we do see a big drop, as you might expect, in food type of restaurants, right? So this is, this is the share. What I'm plotting here is not the total number of firms, is the share of firms registered in that week that have certain name characteristics. And what do we see? Well, we see share of restaurants is about 3 per 1,000 before these kind of week 11 lockdown, and then it drops quite a bit, to a third. these kind of more ethnic foods, there's basically has been no taco restaurants created in New York City after the lockdown. And so for other things, right, other things that you think are more useful right now, cleaning services, delivery, we see slightly the opposite, right? We see, there seems to be this kind of area on the right seems to be higher than on the left, as well as delivery, it seems to be going up. In fact, we even see a series of businesses, not a lot, but 19 businesses that have been founded with the name COVID in them. And so we have COVID tax relief and COVID Save and Brooklyn COVID response. And you actually see, I think this is interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is because it shows this is super kind of simple data that we're showing, but it suggests, right, that entrepreneurs are responding quickly to this changing landscape. And then some of them are choosing to do something different. And there's a little bit of a sense of economic relocation, at least in my mind. And so that's the third takeaway. There is an improvement. It kind of appears to be coming back. I hope this signals optimism. And I hope it also signals that in this, some set of economic relocation where we'll be able to adapt to whatever the future looks like. That's all I had for now. There's our contact information, and thanks again for including me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jorge. That was very interesting. You generated a lot of questions, and so we'll turn back to you in a few minutes after our second two presentations occur. But now I want to turn the floor over to Josh. Josh, take it away.
That's great. Well, first of all, thanks for the chance to talk here. I know Rick and Sabrina are both on the line, so they will handle any hard questions that arrive. So we know that in response to the crisis, we've seen any number of policy initiatives around the globe, with the US being one of the few exceptions, to try to fund and encourage venture capital activity. Many cases, these have been done as matching funds for refinancings of entrepreneurial firms, but a wide variety of structures employed. And when you look at these programs, you see a variety of motivations. First, general one, that productivity is slowing down. Secondly, that's been well documented. There's any number of concerns about the primary place where research has been performed around the world, which is the large corporate research laboratory. Third, that there's a sense that venture capital is able to fund innovation. And finally, that venture capital-backed innovation is in some sense particularly vulnerable to downturns such as the one that we are in today. And it's this which is really going to be our focus. So we'll start with something which is very much in the spirit of what we just heard from Jorge, which is a very quick look at what's happened to date in this crisis. And then we'll go back in the time machine and look at the historical evidence. First, a little bit about the cyclicality of investing, but more particularly focusing then on the impact around innovation. So the first thing we're going to do is just simply say what's happened to VC deal activity since the pandemic hit and the crisis. We're going to pull data from two of our favorite contemporary data sources, PitchBook and CB Insights, which looks reassuringly consistent with each other. And then we're going to divvy up the industries by the impact that the crisis had on those particular industries and see what it tells us. So the short answer is that yes, venture investments have declined. This is done in terms of number of deals. On top is just simply number. The below is the number difference from the previous year. So a little bit in the spirit of what we just saw. And the answer is there has been a drop. But where the drop has been really concentrated is on the early stage, the left column, and not so much on the right-hand column, where one doesn't see a huge appreciable difference, at least when it comes to the number of transactions. Moreover, this drop seems to be broad-based. So what we divvied up here was we looked at the big days and losses in March of 2020. We assign the industries into buckets based on how much the daily losses were. You know, so the good industries are the ones which only lost 6% as opposed to the, you know, travel and so forth, which were in the 12%, the big loser quartile. That's the dark blue. And then on the other side, we put what has been the drop in terms of the number of venture deals. And what one can see is that there's no real appreciable pattern here, that it seems that really across the board, we've seen the drop. Where the difference really is in terms of early stage versus late stage, rather than which industry it is. This pattern is one which is more general. So here we go and grab the Refinitiv venture expert data that we all know and love, because it sort of goes back the furthest. So going back in the 1970s and saying, let's look at the impact of recessions and what it does in terms of the monthly transaction volume. And the basic answer is that there's a big negative effect on the number of deals, the amount of deals, dollars per deal, whatever you want to metricize. There's a big drop, but it's again focused on early stage deals and not so much on later stage deals. So the pattern that we see in the most recent period, in the COVID period, seems to be consistent with that in earlier periods. Now we ask really the question that we care about, which is, what is the impact of all this on innovation? And in particular, what we do is a process of merging this with the Refinitiv data with the US patent data from 76 to 2017. And we identify the patents that are filed by firms which are actively venture-backed while they're still in the portfolio. So we're not looking at the impact on Intel's patents of recent recession. We're looking at the companies in the portfolios of the venture groups. And we try to ask the question of, what is the impact of economic cycles on the patents that venture capitalists are filing? We're going to do everything relative to pure patents in the same month and technology class. And you have to recall that, you know, there's been a large literature that suggests that innovation in general is quite pro-cyclical. So anything we're seeing is relative to that pattern, saying, is innovation by venture-backed firms more or less pro-cyclical than innovation in general? First, though, we just simply make a very simple point, which is that when we look at these venture-backed firms, they are disproportionately innovative. So here we essentially have, over this period, roughly 5.2 million utility patents, around 100,000 of them by firms that are actively venture-backed, filed by firms that are actively venture-backed. And one can see on almost all metrics, the venture-backed firms are hitting above their weight. So if you look at the top decile of the most cited ones, again, relative to other ones in the same year, it's almost 30% of the venture-backed ones are in the top decile. If you looked at the top 1% in terms of citations, almost 5% of those are in the top 1%. That really across these metrics, we see that now it thinks I made one lap at 53 seconds. My pace is a little slow today. You see this sort of frequency of, you see the frequency of the overrepresentation of the venture-backed firms in terms of innovation. Secondly, we see a strong pro-cyclicality. And we can see this in a couple of different ways. We can first just simply look at recessions. And what we see is that the probability that a patent is venture-backed during a recession is substantially lower. Clearly, there is a tracking that takes place. So during periods where more venture capital is raised, one tends to have this more likely that patents are venture-backed. But when we look at, we control both for the amount of venture capital being raised in a given in a given month, as well as whether it was a recession, we see that the recession effect remains very strongly negative. Not only is less venture capital being raised during down periods, but there's also less patenting taking place even beyond that effect. This is true with controlling for domestic and foreign, for the class of the patents, and so forth. Secondly, we see that this pattern is not only in terms of the quantity of patents, but also in terms of their quality. So if we look at the probability that a patent is both venture-backed and particularly impactful, so here in the top 10% or 1% in terms of citations, we once again see this negative, this negative effect of recessions, this strong procyclicality. That during periods when there are recessions, patents are much less likely to be venture-backed and top-cited. Similarly, when we look at other metrics, which we associate with economic impact and importance, we see the same thing. But before that, let me just show one pattern here. This essentially is looking at the share of venture-backed patents that are top-cited ones, less the share that are venture-backed in general. And again, one sees that while there's a sort of a general secular rise over this period, the recessions, which are again here are indicated with the red lines, seem to be associated with relative drops in terms of the amount of innovativeness. We also see this with other metrics. So if we look at the top 10% and 1% in terms of generality or originality, which are essentially measures of the breadth of the impact of the patents. If we look at the closeness to science by using the Marx and Fuego measures of citations to academic science, we again see this consistent pattern, which is that during downturns, during recessions, we see that the patents being filed by venture-backed firms are less impactful on these variety of metrics. We also show that once again, this difference between early and late stage firms is very present. That when we look and say, where is it, for instance, that the patenting by venture-backed firms is declining, and particularly the high impact patenting is declining, we end up seeing that it's taking place in early stage VC portfolios. It's not so much an effect there. It's very significantly different in later stage where one doesn't see this decline, but rather it's this dramatic cutback in terms of the volume of patenting and the innovativeness of that patenting in the early stage portfolios. Finally, we look and ask the question of whether this is taking place in the intensive or extensive margins. In other words, is this an instance where basically firms that are already within venture capital portfolios are less innovative? Or is it a case where different kinds of companies are attracting venture-backed financing? And what we see is that a lot of the action seems to be a lot of the effect seems to disappear when we do assignee fixed effects, which suggests that it's really a change in the kinds of companies that are attracting financing rather than any kind of change in behavior of the firms that are already within the portfolio of the venture capitalists. So just to wrap up, hopefully within my allotted time, though clearly I should not have been timing my laps this morning or else my clock would have worked correctly. In the short run, we've seen this dramatic decline in terms of venture financing, which has been concentrated in the early stage stuff. In general, venture-backed firms have more fundamental influential patents, but not only is the volume of venture-backed patenting very pro-cyclical, showing sharp downturns and recessions, but it's particularly so for the most influential patents. Big questions. What is ultimately the social impact of this? I guess we can debate and say perhaps in some periods there's too much innovation, but that's a question which deserves careful thinking. And then there's also a question around private optimality, which is saying, even if it is detrimental to society, is cutting back on innovation, particularly this high-end innovation, an optimal response during these periods? So thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Josh. That was fantastic. Now I'm going to turn it over to Yael, who will close us out.
All right, can you guys see the slides?
Yes, we can. It's perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, great. Excellent. So I think this presentation will nicely round out what we've seen. So if Chris was telling you about what small businesses are doing, and Jorge was telling you about whether small businesses are launching, and then Josh was telling us a little bit in some senses about whether these early stage venture businesses are launching / getting financing, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what innovation driven businesses are doing, kind of analogous to what Chris and his co-authors were doing. We're a little bit more preliminary than everyone else, and everything you see has been generated in the last 24 hours, and we've still got lots to do, but I think there'll be some interesting patterns here. So we were particularly interested in understanding how the COVID crisis affects innovation-driven entrepreneurs. And if you think about this, and I'm not trying to say that small business is not important, but if you think about sort of a bodega or a dry cleaner and whether it fails, you know, when market demand increases, if the crisis passes, the notion that someone could start another bodega or dry cleaner is not too far-fetched, right? Relatively easy to replicate, known business models, much less dependent on human capital. If you take in contrast an innovation-driven startup, and that dies because of a crisis, it's not quite as obvious that a similar startup will pick up the same innovation or a similar innovation once the economy revives. You know, in part because of the importance of the human capital and how closely the innovation is tied to the human capital, and the fact that ideas are not necessarily easily replicated, and that these markets and business models are unexplored, and someone else may not come up with this idea, and the original entrepreneur may not wish to relaunch. So we were particularly curious in understanding what was happening with these ID startups, and this is, you know, sort of luck of the draw. For the last 3 years, we've been running a randomized controlled trial involving specifically innovation-driven entrepreneurship startups. So this is something called the Entrepreneurship Success Initiative. It was designed to evaluate the effectiveness of rapid skills training for ID entrepreneurs. Think about an MIT entrepreneurial development program, executive education type thing, or an accelerator education module. It was a short program that was taught through the train the trainer model to a group of 610 innovation-driven startups in 11 cities across the US. We started this in early 2017, and I'm not gonna worry too much about the design of the experiment itself, rather as much as we have this experiment. This experiment was ongoing, and the follow-on surveys for the experiment were going out to the participating startups and founders already. So when all of this started, it was natural for us to think about, well, what can we add into the survey in order to learn more about what's happening with this group of startups? The other interesting thing is that, you know, when we started this project, we collected a lot of information about the founders themselves at baseline. Things like risk attitudes and personality traits like Big Five. So I'm going to show you a little bit about how some things around risk attitudes are changing as well, as just some information about how startups are coping with the crisis. So in early to mid-April 2020, we sent out a survey, which we had some specific COVID questions around the effect of the crisis on the startup and its plans, some risk attitude assessment, the same risk attitude assessment that we had given at baseline. We sent this out to all the founders in our sample. Obviously, we're 2 to 3, depending on what city we're in, we're 2 to 3 years into this experiment. When we started out, all of these were pre-institutional money startups. By now, obviously, some of them are shut down and so forth. Some of them have obviously raised capital. There's some variation, which I won't be able to quite show you in this particular presentation, but which we hope to take advantage of as we go forward. We have a 23% response rate. We got about 252 responses back. 170 of them went all the way through to completing all of our risk attitudes questions and time preferences questions and so forth. Some samples of the kinds of questions we were asking specific to COVID are on the right. That's just a selection. Everything I'm going to show you, obviously, entirely descriptive with the goal to kind of put some first facts out there and spur some discussion and maybe some future research. Like Chris said, got to ask who responds. We have a little bit of oversampling of, this particular case, of startups from New York and a little bit of an undersampling from Chicago and Austin, but otherwise, you know, there's some, an oversampling of LA. So there's a little bit of variation from the general geographic distribution, which we'll think about a little bit more as we go along. Basically, you can see that as well, that women were more likely to answer this survey. People who are more conscientious and more open to experience were more likely to answer the survey. We'll talk a little bit about some of these things as we go through. Okay, so first thing we asked them about was sort of, how is this really impacting your business? And maybe a better way to see this is in, oh, the chart's not there, so we won't see it in the chart. We asked them basically, how is this impacting things like cash flow and financing, your number of users, your day-to-day operations, your employees, the strategy that you're engaging in. And the interesting thing is that while certainly a lot of these startups are being negatively affected, whether minimally or severely, by the crisis, there's actually a decent chunk that say that they're not affected, and in fact, not too small group that says that this has actually had positive effect on their business. Perhaps unsurprisingly, you know, here's just the impact on customers and users and cash flows that's broken down by industry. The ones that have had a positive impact, obviously, quite significantly are in the healthcare and biotechnology industry, but at least minimally, you can see the ones that, some large chunk of the ones in e-commerce, and to some extent in some things like media and IT enterprise software, we're seeing potentially some positive impact on their business. The negative impacts obviously are kind of spread across a lot of the other industries in the sample. But there is some variation in that. Then we asked them about just sort of how long, you know, kind of very similar to the kinds of questions that Chris and his co-authors were asking, how long they anticipated they would be able to survive given their current level of cash on hand. A very large chunk of them, a little over half, say that with their cash on hand, they would not be able to survive more than 6 months. Generally speaking, they're expecting to probably run out of cash within somewhere between a month and 6 months. The interesting thing to contrast this to is when we asked them what their probability of shutting down is in the next 6 months. And the difference here is the first question said, if all you had was your cash on hand, how long would you be able to survive? The second question is, you know, tell us what you think your probability of shutting down is going to be. And the mean here is only about 23.5%, which means they're much more optimistic about not actually shutting down. They think they're going to survive over 6 months, irrespective of the fact that over half of them think that they would run out of cash before 6 months. So where do they think, you know, kind of, just to give you a little bit more color on kind of what this looks like, only about 20% of them think that they're not going to have cash deficits as a result of this pandemic. 50% think they will, and about 30% are unsure about this. And if you look at just sort of what they project, so we've got February and March revenues, expenses, and net income here. These are actual numbers. And we asked them to project their revenues, expenses, and net income from April. Their team remarkably optimistic. They're not expecting it to drop very much beyond what they had in March. They're, you know, expecting to drop their expenses and for their net income to actually rise a little bit, which seems again to be very much in line with this notion of the perpetual optimism of the innovation-driven entrepreneur. Where are they planning on getting this cash from then to actually survive? You can see here in terms of what they actually have used up to this point. Primarily, close to half of them have used things like founder savings or credit cards. About half of them are relying on business savings, and about a third of them have relied on business credit cards or lines of credit. But if you look at what they're sort of planning to use and as a way to kind of maybe rationalize the difference between I'm going to run out of cash before 6 months are over, but I don't think I'm going to shut down in 6 months. A lot of them seem to be counting on this notion that they would be able to go to the Paycheck Protection Program or to the EIDL and get emergency disaster loans to cover these gaps in cash. This is being done at a point in time before we sort of knew that the PPP was not going to actually manage to be easily accessible for the startups. Some of them had, in fact, tried, been denied, been deemed ineligible, but a large number of them were really optimistic, kind of really counting on the idea that somehow they would manage to get loans of these sorts to tide them over. If you look at sort of these kind of things like the traditional 7A loans, kind of bridging from your venture capitalist, bridging from your angels, and so crowdfunding, no one very few of them actually expect to use it. Well over half in each category are saying, I have no plans of using these as a funding source. Okay. Lots of them are engaging in cost reduction strategies. Unsurprisingly, they're cutting travel and things of that sort. But you can also see that a lot of them have cut or are planning to cut research and development, which is really interesting. It may be unsurprising that they're reducing advertising and marketing expenses, but the R&D result is a little bit surprising. Quite a few of them have reduced their founder take-home pay or wages and salaries by non-founder employees, but less than half of them, only about 40% of them, are even considering the possibility of furloughing or firing employees. The next thing we do is just looking at what the effect of this has been on risk attitudes. And given that we know that risk attitudes are related to entry into entrepreneurship, and therefore they might relate as well to your willingness to continue trying in this crisis or down state of the world, we were curious to see what these look like. And neoclassical microeconomic choice theory posits and it basically assumes that risk attitudes are this sort of stable ranking, and these are true and innate preferences. But there's a lot of research over the last 2 decades that basically suggests that preferences are more dynamic. They change in response to various events, particularly crises. But they change also in different ways depending on what kind of shock we're looking at. The 2008 financial crisis seems to have increased risk aversion, and there's a variety of papers looking at risk expectations in the wake of the crisis. But there's also a variety of papers that look at things like survivors of natural disasters, which can actually lead to decreases in risk aversion. And given that different shocks have different impacts, and we have something here that's sort of a mix between, we could call a natural disaster and a financial or economic crisis, more so an economic crisis, we were curious to see how this would impact things. So we're just using the sort of classic Barsky et al. QJ 1997 instrument. For time purposes, I'm not going to detail it too much other than to say it separates our respondents into 4 distinct risk preference categories. The lower the number on the category, the more risk averse they are. The higher the number on the category, the lower the number, the more risk averse they are. The higher the number, the less risk averse they are. And what you can see here is basically if you take, and this is within respondents, so this is not comparing 2 populations before and after, it's the exact same people compared to their baseline. What we see here is a shift towards more risk aversion to lower categories versus baseline. Now, there are some people who do shift positive, but there's a much larger number that are shifting negative here. What's interesting is that this looks a little bit different for men versus women. Women are much more likely to make big jumps here from being in the least risk averse category to the most risk averse category, jumping from category 4 to category 1. All of our entrepreneurs, by the way, are much more risk seeking at baseline than the average population. So, sorry, I've got a cat that keeps jumping on my keyboard here. The women, the effect here seems to be much more pronounced in females than in males. One of the things we measured at baseline was a 10-item personality measure. And this gives us basically the big 5 personality traits of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experiences. So one of the things we were interested in seeing is Is there a relationship between some of these personality characteristics and how people actually shift their risk attitudes? We have the population of entrepreneurs as compared to the general population in kind of the classical paper, Gosling et al. We have entrepreneurs in general are more extroverted, more conscientious, more emotionally stable, more open to experiences, and generally speaking, less agreeable. So they seem to place self-interest above getting along relative to the normal population. Extroversion is sort of a given. Openness is about being creative, intellectually curious, and willing to try new things. And emotional stability is about high tolerance for stress and being less emotionally reactive. Conscientiousness is about self-discipline. So these sorts of patterns are not too surprising in terms of what our group of entrepreneurs look like. What we did is then relate just sort of where they are. This is an ordered probit. So we're looking at the COVID risk category, the risk category out of our April 20 post-COVID survey, and kind of controlling for their baseline risk category, and then kind of putting on the right-hand side these categories, these big 5 personality categories, and some controls for age and gender. And the interesting thing is that I think,
Yael?
Yep, I know we're out. This is my last slide.
Perfect.
Yeah. Our prior was probably that emotional stability and the ability to deal with stress would be the one that would load here. What's interesting, and we'll be further exploring as we go along, is that the agreeableness characteristic, the one where our entrepreneurs have a lot less of than the general population, seems to be the one that's most closely related to the shift in risk categories. So lots more for us to do with this in terms of project versus personal risk, and kind of matching to the COVID caseloads and stay-at-home mandates, which at least initially don't seem to matter. But some interesting patterns, and I think the reduction in risk aversion seems to speak a little bit to, the increase in risk aversion might be speaking a little bit as well to some of the patterns we're seeing with perhaps fewer early stage venture-backed businesses happening during this period. So I'm done. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Yael. In the interest of continuity, I'm going to turn to questions for Yael first. And I know that Susan Cohen had a question, and I'm trying to, my participant window disappeared. There we go. Susan.
Hi. Yael, it's great to see you and great work. I found the research, especially that you had the baseline information and ongoing survey, to be quite interesting. One of the things I'm wondering whether or not you have asked, and if you haven't, I think this is actually something that you could ask in the future, is whether or not the entrepreneurial ventures change their business models to accelerate revenue, moving away from a VC model and more towards a bootstrap model?
That's a great question. We haven't. One of the nice things about the fact that this RCT is ongoing is we're in a position to send out another survey, and we probably will within the next month to 6 weeks. So any other questions that people are interested in seeing the answers to, we'd love to know what they are and try and get them integrated. That's a great question. We didn't ask them about pivoting business models.
Thank you, Susan. I want to try to jump around across the presentations just because our time is somewhat limited, and want to give it, give sort of equal billing to each of the 4 papers. Next, I'd like to turn to Jorge. And Jorge, did you consider that there might be sort of a mechanical effect in the drop in business registration that was just arising from the fact that the business registration centers were also closed?
Right, that was the main concern, right? That there was a mechanical sort of an inability of our data temporarily due to COVID to not track the phenomena we're tracking as well as it does usually, because precisely the offices are closed, and so it's hard to register a business. And we don't claim that we rule out this effect completely, not at all. But I think there's a range of evidence that doesn't suggest that this is the main driver. And on the one hand, we see the same thing from John Haltuanger's results filing for EIN, and that's happening all the way in DC, and we see the same pattern. So I think that's very comforting. And you actually, I mean, I didn't show disaggregated by state, but we actually have pretty similar disaggregation, as well as actually, you see, you know, most business registration within state, or almost all of it, happens online. And these recoveries that I showed where the gap actually closed also kind of suggest that, you know, when the entrepreneurs were ready, there was enough action that they were able to register. Even right now, we're April, where there was still kind of a big lockdown. And so I think that really suggests that it was, you know, if entrepreneurs want it, they can register for the most part. And it's really sort of more this issue on willingness to start a firm at that point based on what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Just jumping around a bit, Josh. You know, when you were showing your results, I kept thinking about possible explanations, and there was, among the panelists, there was a lot of Q&A bouncing around. It seems like maybe one mechanism that might be at work here is that in later stage VC, and maybe you can clarify exactly what you mean by later stage, whether it's, I guess, Series C or later or whatever. But with later stage, you know, you have this incentive to keep, you know, they're cash strapped, and you want to put money in there to sort of keep from stranding previous investment. Whereas with the early stage stuff, it's just you don't want to start something. What kind of mechanisms have you thought about for sort of what's driving that key result about later stage versus early stage? And I'm sure there are many more than the one I just proposed.
Ramana, why don't you take that one?
All right, thanks, Josh. You know, in our team, we've sort of talked about 3 different mechanisms. So the first one has to do with the supply of entrepreneurs changing, which is something that we've talked about with Jorge's group discussion as well. The second is perhaps it's harder to actually learn about the viability of a business. So it's harder to test whether there's product market fit when there is a time like this. And so we want to actually not be engaging in putting money into learning. And then the third is that maybe there's a supply side friction. So there's some capital friction, which is making us as early stage investors less likely to want to give money in the first place. And I think we all in our group kind of agree that there's a range of reasons why all of those could be present to some extent or another. The one thing that we have been trying to do is to look at, we seem to find that the results are particularly strong for funds that concentrate on early, that are the smaller funds that focus on early stage. Okay, so larger funds like Sequoia and others appear to be doing this less than those that are specialist small funds. And so that kind of leads us to believe that there may be this challenge around the capital supply chain and financing risk, where early stage investors anticipate that they may not be able to have the capital to make follow-on investments. Late stage investors are focusing much more on their own portfolio companies. They're kind of keeping their dry powder for their own firms. And that makes it such that early stage firms are being much more picky about the kinds of companies that they may fund, and really doing ones that they think would be able to perhaps get to cash flow positive sooner and attract late stage capital more easily. But again, we're nowhere near trying to nail the mechanism here, but we talk a little bit about it in the paper.
Sure. Rick, Sabrina, did anyone else want to add to Ramana's answer?
It was brilliant.
Sorry, I was supposed to answer, but I have had sort of a childcare emergency, and somebody shut off my video. so I think Ramana's answer was great. So I'll just leave it to him.
That sounds fine. We all understand that. So I guess for our last question, because we're almost here at the hour, I wanted to go back to the beginning and just talk to Chris for a moment. I was noticing when you were putting up the summary statistics about sort of the nature of the respondents in your Alignable survey, that you were skewing towards the younger, sorry, the smaller firms, it looked like. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit. We've heard a lot of stories in the press about companies finding it bewildering to apply for the PPP program, and they call their bank and their application gets on hold, and there were delays and these problems. And it's, you know, anecdotally you hear that on the one end, and then you hear stories about, you know, well-connected firms easily getting PPP money. I wondered if you could comment a little bit about how you think that your results might be partly coming from that smaller group, and whether you expect how you think they would maybe generalize across the broader population of startups.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great question. So one of the things that we know in some follow-up work, so Alignable is running their own polls every week, and now they're sharing that data with us, is that smaller firms were less likely to successfully navigate through the PPP application conditional on applying. So with the same intent, they were more likely to have pending applications or applications where money hasn't been delivered. Alignable has collected information about what banks every firm uses. And so we know that sort of the top 5 national banks were slower to deliver money for smaller borrowers relative to state charter banks or community banks. And I think there's an open question that we're trying to answer as to whether the banks were steering money to borrowers that had larger loan balances outstanding because they were able to sort of cover the existing loan balance, which may have biased the program to where banks could target funds to those where they had some liabilities to the bank already. The answer to that question is unclear. We're trying to process that data now, but in principle, we have data on outstanding loan balances and the identity of the banks that people were applying through. So that didn't exactly answer your question, but I think that there's sort of a wide range across the distribution of firms that we know from some of this future activity that does suggest that the skew towards very small firms in Alignable might have indicated that those firms were even harder hit in terms of accessing aid.
No, I think that's very interesting. It'll be interesting to see those results come out in real time as you develop them further. I'm mindful of our time, and as much as I would like to encourage further discussion, we are at the end of our allotted time. So I think that what I should do here is thank our presenters and their co-authors for an hour of great conversation around COVID. I wish that we didn't have to be so concerned about this, but sadly we do. And we've learned a lot today just about how innovative companies and other small companies are responding. Yael's typing something to me about Saturn V celebrating 50 years of Apollo, but anyway, never mind. I'm confused. I'll just conclude by thanking all of you for being on the call, and go to the website to register for our next meeting on the 1st of June, where we'll have Lauren Lanahan present a paper. With that, I'll bid you good night or good afternoon or good morning, and have a great week.